everyone, welcome back to the Intelligent Conversations podcast. Today I have the honor to learn from Bailey Wasdal. Bailey is a former quarterback from St. Francis Xavier University. He has since graduated from school with a bachelor's in business administration and has recently published a book, Stay the Course. So Bailey, thank you for coming on today. I appreciate you taking the time to come on today. But I'm going to open up with this question. As an athlete, so I did sports in high school as well, so I kind of have a general idea. But what was kind of the initial draw, I guess, to football at the start? Let's start there, and then we'll kind of see where we go.
Yeah, that sounds good. And thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be on the show. Like I said, I think you've had a lot of good quality guests, and you're doing great things with the show. And I'm excited to be a part of it and hopefully add some value. To get to your question, my path in football sort of started pretty young. I was kind of exposed to sports from a young age. My dad was always a big sports fan, and I was around it all the time when I was growing up, kind of watching sports and stuff with him. And my dad grew up in a small town, and he didn't really have a lot of opportunities to play sports the way I did. And we had a very different upbringing. The way my parents were kind of raised and the way they kind of chose to raise me. And I think a lot of that was they wanted to provide for me opportunities that they never had. And I think that's typical of all parents. They want to kind of set their kids up on a platform to be able to start kind of from where they started and ascend even higher. And I think a lot of my upbringing, my parents were focused on giving me the opportunities that they didn't have. And a big part of that was sports and football. And so my parents always encouraged me to play football. And, I didn't have my first actual job until I was in university. And a lot of people are like, man, that's crazy. Like, I got my first job, when I was in my high school or even younger. And I just tell them, like, when I was high school age and younger, my parents just said, hey, your job is to play football and, to enjoy, not just football, but, other sports and kind of, those pursuits that you're passionate about. And, they're only there for a finite amount of time in your life. And, I always wanted to make the most of those opportunities and enjoy them while they were there before kind of your career eventually wraps up. And a big part of what took me to St. FX when I did end up going there for university was football. And I sort of chose to delay the start of my sort of business career so that I could go and continue my football career, because I knew, I'd kind of have my whole life to work, but to play football and sports was such a limited, finite portion of my life that I wasn't willing to give up sort of any time to play it that I could.
I think that's awesome. I like that you mentioned that there's only like that little small time frame to kind of do the things. Like, you only really get one shot to do that. And even the professionals, right? Eventually their career comes to an end, and they're usually left at like 30, 40, if they're really good, saying, man, now what? Right. So kind of walk me through that, right? Your career starts wrapping up. You get to the point where it's now what?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think a lot of pro players, and of course I never played professional football, but a lot of athletes that are good enough to play professional, they end up getting to the end of their careers, which inevitably comes, and all they knew was their sport. And it's very difficult for people to transition after that. I was lucky because I had a lot of other talents, I would say, outside of sport. Like, I think I was always a good student. I think I have some talents in the business world, and it was easier for me to transition. And I think when I was younger, it was kind of like, all I thought about was playing football, and that's all I wanted to do. And then as I sort of started to progress through the different levels and kind of get to higher levels. I thought, like I initially thought, my biggest impact in the world was going to be through sport. And then I kind of started to realize, hey, I've got other skills, I've got other gifts. And, I can make an impact elsewhere. And
sorry to interrupt, but would you even say some of those skills that you kind of realized kind of came from football as well, like developing some of those skills?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think there's so many transferable skills from sport, and you learn things like dealing with adversity and all sorts of transferable skills. And I often think back to a quote from Peyton Manning, who was one of the professional athletes I looked up to, and when he retired, he said, "The end of my football career is just the beginning of something I haven't even discovered yet." And I think that's true about me too. And I often reflect on my journey as a football player and collegiate athlete, and a lot of those experiences, they kind of help me and they guide me, and all the things I'm doing today. And I would say even a lot of kind of inspiration for the book was it was derived through experiences in my final years at St. FX. And so it all kind of culminates, and it all kind of carries forward, and you continue to use those skills as long as you kind of continue to reflect on the lessons that you learn from the experiences.
I like that. And that was actually kind of my initial draw to have you on the show, was kind of that story you told at the that last year. It's I know it as St. Francis Xavier. What's the word you've been using? St. FX?
Yeah, St. FX. Yeah, just FX for
St.
Francis Xavier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, that sounds like a lot easier to say. So your time there, that last season, could you kind of describe to the listeners what that was like?
Yeah. So, I will say this. So I was fortunate to have a pretty long career. I know you're in the U.S. and typically the collegiate career is 4 or 5 years. I ended up actually playing 8 seasons because eligibility is a little longer in Canada. And also we had the COVID year where we lost a season, and eligibility was actually extended for that. And so I graduated in the year that the season was canceled. And instead of sort of moving on and just kind of moving forward with my accounting career, which would be kind of my post-football career, I decided to put everything on hold and go back to school for another season and just finish out that last year of eligibility that I still had because of the canceled season. And, I had this vision, I suppose, of kind of coming back, playing quarterback for the team, leading the team to a championship, and kind of riding off like that, and that being my final season. And the year before the COVID canceled season, we sort of struggled as a team, as an offense. We were young. We had a young offensive coordinator, and we really struggled. And then we had the COVID year, and then when I came back the year after in 2021, the team was really they were kind of ready to move on and have a younger guy play. And I ended up kind of putting everything on hold, and I came back, and I ended up backing up that year. And so, it was kind of my final season, and it was not playing out the way I thought it would at all. And I think that really kind of spurred this sort of mentality, or this kind of mindset that is kind of morphed into the concept of authenticity. And when I was kind of going through that season and just dealing with sort of the disappointments of not playing out the way I wanted to, I sort of just adopted the mindset of focusing on what I knew was absolutely certain in the moment. And if I was willing to make a decision, based on what I knew was for certain in the moment. And, that excludes all these external factors that I have no control over, such as, whether I play and whether, what the coaches make as their decisions. I can't control that. And, if I'm willing to go back and, play this season based on what I know for certain, which is, what's guaranteed in the moment. And, when I think about those factors, it's things like being able to go back and spend time with the people that are there and continue to have those relationships with the people that I made that are there. If that, which I know is guaranteed, if that is enough, if that's enough of a reason for me to be able to make that decision, then, based on those guaranteed factors, then that's what I'm going to do it, so it's just making decisions based on what is a guaranteed outcome of that decision. And the only thing that's guaranteed is the outcomes in the moment. And I think when you make decisions like that, that's when you're kind of acting in your most authentic self.
I agree. I think, to your point, we can only really react or respond to the moments that are happening right now. Now, right, we can look at those decisions that we have to make right now. And if we continue to make good ones, right, that can set us up later, right? So then we don't have to worry about some of the decisions that some people come across. But at the end of the day, right, it comes down to those decisions that happen in the moment and kind of right there and then. So I'm kind of curious then, what's your goal setting strategy then? If like to find a goal, what's the strategy there?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because I think for sure goals they're future oriented in nature. But I think the biggest thing is to kind of focus on the process of that goal in terms of, are you satisfied with the decisions you made? And, are you sort of satisfied and striving? Like, I think you can have goals that are future oriented, but whether your decision to strive for them, results in contentment or disappointment, I think should be hinged on your effort in the moment and your decisions in the moment. Like, for example, if you decide, you're gonna take up running or something like that, and if your goal is to run a marathon or whatever, and in the moment, you're making decisions to train. If you never reach that goal, like, because that's future oriented, if you never ran that marathon, you never hit that time, if you're satisfied with the decision in the moment of training, in other words, you just intrinsically enjoy the training, then I think you're making decisions through the lens of authenticity. Whereas conversely, if you're saying, I'm going to train now, but I just absolutely, despise it, and I'm only doing it for this future outcome, and then that future outcome never materializes, and as a result, you just feel disappointed in the actions you took and the decisions you made, then I think that's the wrong way to think of it. I think you got to be satisfied in the moment of the decision, and kind of regardless of the future outcome, and then that's kind of the focus. And I think people talk about sort of focusing on the process, and so it's a similar concept that's kind of been around, but I think to take it through the lens of authenticity kind of adds another element of it, because authenticity has become such a buzzword, and I think it creates a more solid understanding to just what the media is able to provide, and which is really not much, because like I said, I think it just gets thrown around and people are like, oh, authenticity, but it doesn't really mean anything to them.
So I'm kind of curious then, what would your definition, what would you think authenticity is?
Yeah, so I think of authenticity as, I describe it as the set, you have a certain set of values, that are important to you, and that represents sort of a level of potential that you can achieve, if you act in accordance with those values. And authenticity, it's really like, if you think of the word integrity, I think there's a lot of misconception about that word, because, people would say integrity is kind of like you do the right thing, or, what do you do when no one's watching kind of thing. And the word integrity actually comes from the root word integer, which is whole. And so I think that it's kind of this like alignment between what you say and what you do. And so I think, as opposed to thinking of like, what do you do when no one's watching? I think a better question is, what do you do when you're watching? Because authenticity is really between you and yourself, and you're always watching you always know what your decisions are. You know what it is you truly value, and if the decisions that you make are in accordance with those values that you hold. And so authenticity to me is just an alignment of sort of what it is you truly value, and then the actions that you're taking, the decisions that you're making, are they in accordance or in integrity with those values? And I think where people can get lost is, there's a few ways for sure, but one of the really big ones is they never stop to think and ask themselves difficult questions of what is their values, and sort of live an intentional life by saying, okay, what are my values? What is actually important to me? And then evaluate, okay, how am I showing up? What decisions am I making day to day? How am I choosing to live? And evaluating, are those the same? Do they agree? Are they in integrity?
I would even say, so I think I like your point where I think everyone has to have those values, or essentially a standard that they strive to live at. Because, right, if we just react to everything in the moment, right, and we don't have kind of those values to kind of guide us, then we just kind of wander aimlessly, and we don't really know where we're going to end up. And we end up kind of living pretty terrible life. But where we have some of those values, I think, in place, it kind of gives us a direction of, all right, I'm not going to cross this line, right? This is the line of, I'm just not going to, like honesty, for example, right? I'm just going to be an honest person every day, right? Doesn't matter. Even if people don't want to hear it, I'm going to be honest, right? You won't cross that line. It kind of guides you in your decision making. So then when those moments come up, some of those difficult decisions, you're able to make them because now you have your values in place. I don't know. Am I kind of hitting that on the head?
No, I do. I think you summarized it really well. And that's the thing. You say you have to have, as you just pointed out, you kind of have to have this values framework, but you have to know what that is for you. And one of the points I try to make in the book is that it really doesn't matter what that set of values is for you. Like, it's unique to you, and it doesn't matter what it is. Like, it can be different from person to person, and there's no sort of psychological consequence for having any set of values. Like, whatever you choose to deem as important to you, that's perfectly fine. And other people will value different things, and that's perfectly fine. Where you do get into trouble is, I believe there's psychological consequences for not acting in accordance with your values. And it really becomes a framework for decision making. And as you just kind of summarize, people can go through life reactively because they never stop and sort of intentionally build that framework on a conscious level, so that when it comes to a point of making decisions, they have that framework to rely on. They already know what's important to me. And then, make decisions to live your life intentionally based on that. A lot of people just kind of go through life decision through decision without really reflecting on what's actually important to them and using that to go forward. And they live life reactively and unfulfilled.
I agree. So there's a guy I've read his book, and I like that you say that the reaction and the responding. I think he actually touches on that. a lot of people, he talks about first responders, they actually solve the problem at hand. Whereas if you react, like, right, you see a horrible car crash, for example, right? The first reactors are like, oh crap, what do I do? Right. They start panicking. But the first responders, they actually go in and they're like, all right, this is what we need to do. They're thinking clearly. They know exactly what to do. And I think kind of differentiating those two words, right? Are you a responder or are you a reactor? I think that's something a lot of people could benefit from. So I'm actually kind of curious, how did you kind of come up with this? Because, I mean, you got a bachelor's in business administration. How did you kind of come about this? I mean, you kind of touched on it, but like, does this decide, you know what, I'm going to write this down and share it with the world?
Yeah, it is interesting because, you know, from an educational standpoint, kind of what I was studying at university is really quite different from kind of some of the topics in this book. And, you know, I think at some point I would like to find the coalescence between the concepts of authenticity and business. But yeah, I would say this one is kind of more from a personal philosophy, self-development perspective. And the way I think of it, like I've certainly had some unique experiences in my fairly young life. I don't think I've had any. I don't think I've had a more unique life than the average person. I just think I have a greater propensity to reflect and sort of draw conclusions from those experiences. You know, I think of it like, you know, I kind of liken it to like a comedian. Like, you know, I don't think a comedian's life is any funnier. Like, I don't think anything kind of funnier happens to him more than any other person. It's just he kind of sees the life through that lens where, you know, how can he make things into comedy? And for me, it's like, you know, I had experiences that are not necessarily atypical, like I'm in the habit and have developed a muscle of sort of self-reflection. And there's this quote I included in the book from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says, all of life is an experiment. The more experiments you make, the better. And I just think of that as like, you know, every time you make a decision, you have an opportunity to learn something about yourself based on how you feel as a result of having made that decision. And, you know, so you choose to spend your time and your energy one way, you know, a certain way. And then if you reflect on how you feel as a result of having spent your time like that, you know, you can draw a conclusion on, you know, is that important to you to spend your energy and time that way? And then if it is, then you make a conscious effort to do it more often. But, you know, like the quote is, it's like, you know, your life is the experiment, but the experiment is only relevant if you reflect on the results to draw conclusions and move forward with. And so, yeah, I mean, the process of the ideas in this book it's really just a result of reflection and just, you know, reflecting on my experiences and trying to find meaning from them. And I think that's something that anybody can do. You know, because like I said, you know, I don't think my life's any more unique than anybody else's. It's just you take the time to reflect on those experiments and learn about yourself. And so, you know, I think anybody can kind of develop that skill.
I especially agree with that last part where you take the time to learn about yourself, right? I think a lot of people, they find themselves, right, they're making decisions regardless, right? Every second that passes by, they're making choices. But then actually taking that step back, like you said, and reflect, and then say, I wonder, like, I made this decision. This is and that's kind of the beauty of the past, is you can look and say, well, this is kind of how it turned out. That's interesting, right? Maybe I should go in next time with this, like, more energy, or maybe I should, like, I definitely do this on the podcast. I remember listening to some of my past episodes. I'm like, man, I sound monotone, or man, I didn't like what I said there. And you look back and it's like, all right, how can we improve off that? And I think that's ultimately what we're all trying to do, is we're all trying to improve our lives in some shape or form. I don't know if that's something you'd agree with there.
No, I totally agree. And I think what is so appealing to this process is, you make decisions, you reflect on them, you learn about yourself, you learn about how you value spending your time, and you move forward with a more intentional life. And, I think it's addicting because you get to shape the life you want by spending more time intentionally doing the things that you love.
I agree. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to do the things we love. So I'm going to use this as the intelligent question of the day. Everyone encounters, I would say, difficult decisions, right? Some of those choices where they're kind of, again, in the balance. It's like, oh, or in some cases, maybe those values like that we talked about earlier, maybe they start conflicting with each other and you have to really make a tough call. What would you say to those people that kind of encounter those difficult decisions? How would you come to a decision to react there, respond to the...
Yeah, I think what happens often is people will kind of be persuaded to compromise on their values while making decisions because they may see a short-term gain as a result of kind of making that compromise. Like they think they act out of accordance with their values because they perceive some sort of short-term benefit or gain by doing so. And I think once you understand what your values are, you have a strong grasp of that, and you're confronted with opportunities to make a decision where you're being challenged. I think it requires a lot of faith to act in accordance with your values. And by faith, I mean you have to. And I don't necessarily consider it in terms of religious faith. Like it just, like, I don't consider myself religious, but I consider myself faithful in the sense that I have trust in something bigger than myself, and I think that guides you in the moments when you don't understand, like when you don't understand why the outcomes are what they are. Mm-hmm. And it kind of helps you keep that long-term perspective where, hey, if you just continue to stay steadfast to your values, it's going to work out in the best way possible for you in the long run, even if in the short run you don't necessarily like the outcome. So I would just say, have faith that in the long run, if you know your values and you stick to them as your decision-making framework, you're going to end up in the best possible place that you could be.
I love that. And that right there is the intelligent answer of the day. And I think I like the point that you made to faith, where you just kind of got to stick with your values, even if you kind of don't know, and especially keep that long-term perspective, because in this world of short-term gratification, all these things that are all over the place, short-term influences, kind of keeping that long-term perspective, kind of, one, it helps build a better future for you. And two, you're able to analyze your decisions better, right, from the past and learn. And you just find life's more enjoyable. And I like to say, if you look at the long term, you have a better, long-term life, right? So the long-term moments are more enjoyable. Whereas if you're so obsessed with the short term, right, making those enjoyable, then your long term is going to be pretty miserable. And that's just kind of my thoughts there.
Yeah. No, hey, that's a good way to kind of tie it all together. That's good.
And it ties into authenticity as well. It's starting to make sense to me. It's like, all right, you got to be your authentic self. And
yeah. No, and that's the thing. Like, I think there's an intuitive understanding. Like, I think a lot of people understand it in the sense that people felt it. They maybe just never thought about it or took the time to try to articulate what it means to them. And I think that's kind of part of what makes the book accessible is it's not heavily researched. The experiment is your life. You have access to the data. It's there for you. You felt inauthenticity. It's just, do you recognize it when it happens, and are you intentional enough to course correct?
There you go. Awesome. Well, Bailey, thank you for coming on today. And you mentioned your book, Stay the Course. Where can people find that? And heck, if people want to reach out to you, find you, what's the best way they can do that?
So best place to get it is just on Amazon.
Awesome.
If you just check Stay the Course on Amazon, you'll find it. And my website is staythecoursebook.ca. So that's a good place to also check out kind of what's going on, and you can reach out to me through the website as well there.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on today. I appreciate the knowledge you shared, and I'm sure the listeners learned stuff because I definitely learned as well. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me, Josh, and it was a pleasure to speak with you. And you're doing great work with the podcast. So look forward to keeping an eye on the show. And
yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot. So everyone, as you can tell, that is Bailey Wasdal. He's a very intelligent person, has great things to share. I challenge you guys, if anything spoke to you today, to check out his book. He dropped the information there for you guys. Stay tuned till next week. We have a great guest lined up for you guys. See you guys next week, and let's get after it. Hey everyone, if you liked this episode and would like to hear more, be sure to hit that subscribe or follow button. We release a new episode every Wednesday for you guys to listen to. Thank you guys so much for the support that you give. We could not have done this without you guys. If you would like to be a potential guest on the show, check out intelligentconvos.com and fill out the form there. Thank you guys again, and let's get after it.